This panel's a little bit different, I think, from the previous one. We're focusing on specifically media access and the balance between patient privacy. And we've touched on that throughout the day, but I think we're going to be honing in on the topic of how can the media gain access to hospitals, medical centers, and patients, and where does that intersect with the patient's right to privacy. So we'll start with Dr. Hadley Calloway, who's president of the North Carolina Medical Society.
Thank you very much. I'm an orthopedic surgeon, a Carolina graduate, so I appreciate the opportunity to come back.
Thank you.
I wrote something out. If I don't get through it, then I can give it to you as written form. But I often tell patients that one of the most important things Bill Clinton did for our job is to end job lock, which is what kept people from changing jobs because they were afraid their pre-existing condition was going to keep them from getting new insurance. But one of the things that also he gave us was Hipaa, which caused a lot of problems for physicians. Physicians have always protected patients' privacy. Patients share with us all kinds of crazy things. I don't know whether it's because they share with us so many things, but it sort of becomes mundane. You realize that life is hard and people have odd ways of getting through it. But we always keep that private, and I think that's the main goal of physicians, and it hasn't been changed by Hipaa at all. Hipaa appears to be an attempt to institutionalize privacy. It was expensive for our country. I looked up on Google Hipaa consultant. I got 170,000 hits. And every one of these consultants was taking money out of the healthcare system, and I sure hope it was worth it. We always struggle between privacy and transparency. We're not allowed to post our patients' names on their rooms, for example, or on their charts. So this is all despite the danger of mistaking one patient for another. Privacy concerns also make it hard to do healthcare system improvement, yet we have healthcare report cards posted on the web. Electronic records should have made coordination of care easier, but doctors are now afraid to email records to each other because of Hipaa. And in the midst of all this discussion, the doctors themselves feel more exposed than ever because we have web report cards, data banks, practice profiling, mandatory second opinions, and drug companies calling us up because they saw we switched our patient from one drug to another. So what are the main problems I see with Hipaa? Well, first, we all interpret it too strictly. We've all heard a lot about that. I don't think there's any conspiracy. It's just overzealous enforcement of regulations. Second, Hipaa gets in the way of adult children looking after their parents from afar. And we hear about this because the parents sometimes can't give consent because they've had a stroke or they're demented or they have mental illness. And the child tries to call and find out where they are, and they sometimes can't find out. And that's made the healthcare power of attorney critically important, and I hope people will take care of that problem. Second, Hipaa has taken away some of our sense of community and connectedness, and that comes into play when the pastor can't find out who's in the hospital, or the neighbors don't know who's sick or injured because it's not in the newspaper. And we know less and less about our public health officials. So we've lost the therapeutic and educational value of sharing our illnesses with each other. Fourth, the Hipaa seems like it will cause problems when we have disasters. For example, the September 11th disaster occurred prior to Hipaa, and there were all these lists of patients who were in the hospital, and that's the way people found out if their loved one had gotten killed or whether they were in the hospital. I'm not sure how they're going to find out about that in the event of another disaster, which is inevitable. I think without accurate and timely reporting, people will resort to rumor and panic and frantic visits to the hospital, and I'm not sure how we can avoid that, but we should plan for it. And even in smaller disasters, you wonder how can you report on a building collapse if you can't mention how many people were hurt or how exactly they got hurt, and how can you report on shark bites if you can't say how badly the person was injured. So there's some balance between privacy concerns and the policy needs for the public. Fifth, I think it does seem to limit reporting on public health issues because of the issue of looking into patient records if somebody's had lead poisoning or somebody's had TB or somebody's had meningitis, and we need to very carefully figure out the proper balance there. And sixth, it makes it hard for reporters to find flaws in the healthcare system. I personally think a lot of healthcare issues are system problems, not necessarily physician problems, and it's ironic how healthcare is a big team effort until you get sued and then suddenly you're the captain of the ship. So I think we've all heard of problems where healthcare systems have gone awry, and it's harder for reporters to identify the injured patients and review their records, and whistleblowers are scared to say anything about it, even though they're supposedly able to report to the government agency, but they can't report to the press. And in this way, protecting the privacy of the patient inadvertently hides problems of healthcare delivery. I think our best hope for the future is that electronic medical records will give us anonymous, aggregated data about quality. And this solution will be like detecting problems in the manufacturing line by looking at statistics instead of studying the individual widgets as they come off. And before I close, I should mention that HIPAA does affect sports medicine, which is my specialty, because some HIPAA consultants feel that you can't reveal the athlete's injuries to the coach without the patient's permission, which is sometimes difficult to document during the time of the game. Fortunately for pro sports, it's a workers' comp issue. And workers' comp, you can always report to the employer, which is the coach. So no wonder reporting about sports injuries is so hard and sometimes so inaccurate. I guess, in conclusion, I would say that HIPAA protects patients by making systematic our traditional approach to healthcare privacy. However, we need to make the ability of family members to communicate with their caregivers more easy. We need to improve HIPAA by restricting how pharmacies and drug companies share data, which I think is probably excessive. We need to remove barriers to electronic communication among physicians. We need to consider a means of temporarily lifting HIPAA requirements when there's a national disaster. And overall, we need to try to balance the need for privacy with the importance of community. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. That was quite impressive. Thanks, Hadley. To Hadley's left is Jean Fisher, who's staff writer for the News and Observer. Jean?
Thank you. I am the medical news reporter, and I wanted to sort of break my comments into two parts because I actually have it pretty easy as a medical news reporter because a lot of what I do is not breaking news. A lot of what I do, I report on clinical medicine, novel treatments, research. And in those cases, a lot of times these folks to the left of me, they want me to write those stories, and often they're calling me with a story pitch saying, I have a great story for you and I have a patient. So they've already identified the patient, they've already obtained consent. My job, it's not paint by numbers, but you know, it's pretty easy. I get contact with those patients. That's great. So I'm glad to say that. The area where we have a lot of problems is with breaking news. When there's a public health concern, if there is any kind of accident victim, I think we've covered that some in these sessions. Those reporters, I'm often not the one, covering crime, so I'm not calling to find out where the victims from the bus crash went and, how many patients were taken to Wake Med, how many were taken to UNC. But those reporters really have a lot of headaches. It's really difficult. There's not a lot of consistency, I think, is the biggest complaint that I hear from my colleagues. When they call, it reminds me a little bit of animal behavior experiments where if a rat presses the lever, they get an electric shock every time. Pretty soon they stop pressing the lever. But other rats, they press the lever one time, they get a pellet of food. The next time they press it, they get the shock. They keep going back because sometimes they get food. That's sort of how reporters are. We call one hospital. This time you're lucky. The hospital maybe recognizes that there's public value in letting people know what happened to the victims of the bus crash. And they recognize, okay, yes, we can work with you. Maybe they're not going to, no hospital is going to give you the identities of the patients, but they can say, yes, we got, 6 victims from the bus crash. We've got, 3 women, 2 men, and a child, and they're in such and such condition. There are some hospitals that will do that, but then the very next time you call, and this time it's a car wreck, and they're sorry, I can't confirm that patient's, I have no information on that patient. So I think the frustration is that nobody's doing it the same, even individual hospitals aren't doing it the same. So we don't really know what the rules are, because I think the rules are fluid and they're open to interpretation, and that is frustrating, especially when you're under the pressure of deadline. I think one thing also, I'll go back to my beat reporting, it has made it so that it takes a longer time to do my job. When you're off deadline, it used to be if I were doing a story about childhood vaccines, I could go to a pediatric practice, just sit in the waiting room. When somebody came up whose child was having vaccines, they would sort of ask Mrs. Jones, are you willing to talk to a reporter? If they said yes, they would just point them over to me, and that was great. Now what I have to do is I would call in advance, usually a couple days, and say, who do you have on the schedule tomorrow? Can you call the patient and see if they would be willing to talk with me? It basically puts I'm asking a lot of the practice manager or whoever is at that, private practice. I have had people say to me, cite Hipaa, and say, I'm sorry, I can't give out any patient information because of Hipaa. That really makes me mad because it's not Hipaa. What they're really telling me is, I don't have time for you, I don't want to help you, go away. And that's fine, they may not have time. That's always an acceptable response, but it doesn't have anything to do with Hipaa. There is a way for people in the medical system to work with reporters in a way that complies with the law, and I have many, many people who are willing to do that, and I'm always grateful when they are. but when they cite HIPAA, I think that has been one of the unintended consequences, is that there is so much fear about the fines, which are significant, that it's engendered a climate where a lot of times organizations just don't want to tell you anything because of HIPAA, and they'll just say, I can't deal with you, because that's the default response, is to say no information. We're news gatherers. Our default is to get as much information whenever we can at all times. So they're in inherent conflict. I had a colleague share a really funny story. There was a car crash that this was a couple of years ago, but a car hit a horse, and the horse was taken to the NC State Veterinary Hospital. The reporter called and asked about the status of the horse, and citing HIPAA, the NC State Veterinary Hospital declined to comment. And the reporter said, it's a horse. It walks around naked in a field all day. It doesn't have privacy. You know, how can you possibly, be citing HIPAA? But they did, and they refused to give information about the status of the horse. So I think that there's sometimes there's a climate of the absurd. On the other hand, I, as a reporter, I'm willing to accept that the average person doesn't need to know, strictly speaking, whether or not the wreck that they saw on 40, if the person died. They don't have to know that, and if private individuals don't want their family's private information or their own private information out there, I think we as reporters do need to respect that, and we need to accept that we're not always going to be able to get the information. I think the gentleman on the last panel made a point that reporters need to use their heads and be more creative about getting information. I think we are. We had a situation fairly recently where there were a couple of women who worked at a soup kitchen who were beaten by one of the patrons. And one woman died, but the other one survived. Her family was not giving out much information at all, but that woman had a MySpace page, and her friends were posting updates on her condition. And so what we did was we found that information and we used it in our stories, and we cited MySpace. And we do that. We use Facebook, we use MySpace, we use all of these different sites where people have their own personal pages. There's actually a wealth of information. So we are often able to work around HIPAA. It does put the burden on us. We're not always able to do it. And I think, we pick and choose when we do. But I think, and as has been discussed earlier today, there's value. Dr. Callaway mentioned this. There's value. People do want to know, especially when there is a violent crime in a community, or when someone is sick, that touches people. They do want to know because they care about what's happened to their neighbors and their friends. And it's not, reporters get accused of being vultures a lot for going after families when they're in crisis. And we don't do it because we enjoy it or we want to exploit people. We do it because these things shake the fabric of communities, and we want to share that information and help bring people together whenever we can. So,
well, thank you, Jean. I guess if we've learned anything today, it's that pit bulls and horses are covered by HIPAA, right? That's,
shouldn't be.
Not really. Just one follow-up question, Jean. So what's your best strategy in dealing with a recalcitrant health provider, medical center, who is that's not allowing you access? Do you have a strategy that tends to work better than another in order to gain access eventually to the patient?
Well, I have to say, and it's not just because they're sitting next to me, but I really have not had a lot of problems myself. I guess, with hospitals. Larger hospitals, especially, are almost always going to work with me. They usually, as I said, want to. If there's a situation where they just simply can't, they usually just tell me I can't. We try these other things, like we try to say, well, what do we know about the patient? A lot of times people who cover breaking news, cover car crashes and things like that, they do work with law enforcement and they try to get the information that way. If I'm dealing with a private physician's office, I just pick up the phone and call the other one. That's the great thing about the practice of medicine. There's about 20,000 doctors in the state, so if one won't help me, then I just keep calling. So.
And talking about doctors, I wanted to ask Dr. Callaway, what is the medical society doing to better inform physicians that they are not violating HIPAA when they go ask one of their patients to sign a consent in order to be interviewed by a reporter? Is the medical society doing anything to inform physicians who really are misinformed about HIPAA?
I don't think there's any specific program like that. Our approach has been to try to help physicians stay out of trouble, so we've had HIPAA seminars and so forth. A lot of them are aimed at practice managers as opposed to the physicians themselves. The physicians typically have not ever been in the position of revealing people's private details, so it's not like HIPAA's really changed their activity to make it more restricted. I guess if HIPAA creates these exceptions where people realize that they can reveal something, then we should probably do a better job to educate them about that.
Well, thank you. Our next panel member is Stephanie Creighton, who is Media Relations Manager for UNC Healthcare and a former TV reporter. Stephanie?
I don't have a prepared speech, but I did want to just talk maybe just a little bit about, I think the perspective that I come from in terms of working with the media on some of these issues pertaining to HIPAA is having been a reporter and understanding some of the pressures that reporters face in terms of deadline, in terms of editors or news directors or executive producers kind of breathing down their necks to get information. So I think Debbie Crane said it best, that in a situation where they're trying to seek information from the hospital, sometimes the PIO is going to be your best advocate in really trying to work with them to get that information that you need. I'm very glad to hear that Jean doesn't feel that we are a hindrance to the work that she's trying to do, because that's not what we try to do day to day, is try to figure out how we can prevent reporters from getting information. I honestly do want to help the reporter because I understand the position that they are in, and I understand what it is that they're trying to get. But then on the flip side, I also, I do walk through the halls of the hospital, and I do sometimes have to approach families and have to ask the difficult question, are you willing to talk to a reporter? And sometimes I can see in their face, they've not even thought through that process. They're trying to still grapple with the fact that their loved one is ill or, about to die or has died. And, to then come to them and say, are you willing to share your story with the public about what has happened? And that's a tough thing. And I think that's a tough thing for any of us if we were in that position. And so I'm glad that a lot of the reporters that I've worked with are very sensitive to that fact. And if nothing else, they just say, Stephanie, just ask the question. When you have the opportunity, ask that question. And I am willing to do that. And I try to be very honest with the reporters and say, this is the position the family is in. This is what they're feeling. I don't think it's in the best interest of the patient, which is what, we really have to be concerned with, which is the best interest of the patient. So in terms of HIPAA, we definitely, we don't have all the answers in our office, but we work very closely with the hospital lawyers and try to find the answer. If Jean were to call me and say, can you give me this information? If I don't know the answer, I'm willing to ask the question to find out from the people who can find the answer. So I've not had really very many challenges. I think probably earlier in our discussions we talked about the opting out. I think that can be a challenge when a reporter has called and has found out that a patient is in perhaps critical condition. They may call back the next day. We don't have information for them. I think by now they're sort of kind of getting it that I can't say because of HIPAA in some instance, either it's opt out or something has changed from the day before. The other issue is kind of the challenges that are faced with law enforcement in terms of they're able to give information about a patient's condition and we maybe cannot. So they may say that, a patient is in critical condition, but then when the reporter calls us, we may not have information to give that reporter. So that presents some challenges, I think, in my position, because it's, what are you saying, Stephanie? You're saying that the person isn't there, or what are you saying? Well, I can't really say, especially if they've opted out. But I think reporters are starting to kind of sort of understand the position that we're in those instances.
Let me clarify something. Are you sometimes the person who asks the patient for the consent to be interviewed by the media rather than the healthcare provider?
Sometimes there's situations, specifically to media. We have media consent forms that we deal with.
Mm-hmm. That's
so
what I'm talking about.
It's separate than them being on the directory. We don't ask a patient to be on a directory, but we do deal with consent forms to speak to media, to have their picture taken, to have information released to the media. So yes, I am responsible for talking with patients and seeing if that is something that they're interested in doing, and then having them sign the proper forms.
I mean, I think that's a really good thing, and in all fairness to Dr. Calloway, it does put the patient in a difficult position when the patient's doctor is asking for the permission, because there is an implicit, I believe, need for patients to please their doctors. And there may be an assumption or an unconscious assumption on the patient's part that if I don't please the doctor, maybe the doctor won't like me or won't be my ally. So, I mean, I think in medical centers it's probably it's a much easier position than in private doctors' offices, where it's essentially going to be, probably in many cases, the doctor asking the patient, are you going to be willing to speak to Gene Fisher?
I have had that
from the News
happen, by the way.
Observer?
I've had physicians just refuse and say it's not appropriate for me to ask my patients to talk to you, sorry.
And that's not entirely a cop-out when they make that argument.
Yeah, the person I'm thinking of was actually a psychiatrist, so there were especially, special reasons why they didn't want to.
I mean, I've been a party to conversations where that, among physician journalists who brought up that point, that it's puts the physician in a sometimes an untenable position, not always. Did you have a question there? Yes.
I was just going to mention that
Karen.
it really points out how critical it is for the press to work with our office, I mean, our public affairs office, because we are working to get the appropriate permissions and things like this, but when press members decide to walk through the hospital to find their patients or go directly to try to bypass offices and go directly to the patient and take pictures and things like this, we're really, really running into some big issues of violation of privacy that we have to act really strongly, strongly in behalf of our patients.
Well, adding to that, Karen, I mean, it's an issue of, you might be focused, you as in the media might be focused on one particular patient, but you still have all other patients that are being treated around that patient. And so we're not just solely focused on that patient, which we are addressing, but we also have to be concerned about the other patients as well, because when you're walking through the halls with your camera or your notepad, you may see other things in other people. You may see someone you may see, and they didn't ask to be seen in the hospital, but so that's an issue that we face as well.
As a segue to introducing Lauren Williams, who's a senior media relations officer from the Duke Medicine Office of News and Communication, how do you feel about a reporter going directly to one of your doctors, bypassing you to make initial contact, and then having made contact with the doctor, then contact you? Because in fact, that's the strategy I advise my students to follow, rather than rather than going through you directly, is to make, if they can make initial contact, do it, and if they're unsuccessful, then to contact you. If they do make contact, and I'm talking television in this case, before they come onto your facility, to then contact you and say, I've made contact with Dr. So-and-so. I just want you to be aware of that. Can you help make this a reality? What do you think about that strategy?
Well, we'd rather it didn't work.
I know that.
Actually, we feel that actually kind of goes around us to the point of making us kind of a moot point, and we feel like it's our job to not only help facilitate things, because sometimes doctors just don't know necessarily how to deal with those kinds of requests. And just to be able to help them navigate the system, to say, well, this is who this reporter is, we've worked with them before, these are kind of stories they've done. We feel that sort of helps them. Otherwise, it's kind of, they're sort of going to these stories blind. And it's also sort of our job to kind of help the reporter on the other side sort of facilitate. I mean, calling a doctor, I mean, like you're saying, if you're not successful, you're telling them to go ahead and call us. So if they're successful, then it's easy. But a lot of times getting through to a doctor, getting a doctor to call you back, getting a doctor to agree to a time, that kind of thing is difficult. So that's sort of one of the reasons that we're there. Although that said, we have a lot of especially high-profile researchers and doctors who have relationships with media. I'm thinking of one guy in particular who's got a good relationship with Gina Colada at the New York Times, and she calls him all the time to vet stories. And I would never step in the way of that relationship and try to say, oh, everything has to come through us. But when we media train people or when we talk to doctors, we tell them, for the reasons that I explained earlier, that if someone calls you, tell them to call us or direct that, or you hang up the phone and call us and say, this person called me, can you call them back and find out what it's about, find out what it would entail, that kind of thing. We run into it also a lot, and it's not necessarily a media issue, but with industry-related things, and that's sort of a whole nother issue. But they'll call and say, oh, our crew's coming on Friday at 12, and we're going to be here all day shooting for this video or whatever, that kind of thing. And it just makes things much easier and smoother, I think, for everybody if it comes through our office. So that's kind of what we tell both reporters and doctors and researchers.
Well, I didn't mean to take all your time by answering my
No,
question,
that's
but
fine.
if there's something you want to add to that, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm one of 6 media relations officers at Duke, and I cover cancer specifically, but sort of we all kind of operate under the same kind of guidelines. So with Hipaa, our interactions with Hipaa, I think, are kind of broken down into sort of 3 areas. The first are the kind of stories that Jean was mentioning earlier, where either we've publicized a study and we want to make sure we have a patient lined up, so if anyone's interested in covering the story, that we have someone already, we can say this person's willing to talk. And those are pretty easy to facilitate most of the time, but it is our policy actually to have the first contact to the patient has to come through the doctor's office to say, would you be willing to talk to media? And if they say yes, then I can call them, but it's our policy that would be a HIPAA violation to give their name and phone number to me to call and say, all of a sudden you're getting a call from a media relations officer at Duke, well, who's this person? So we have them call first and say, would you be willing to talk to media? And if they say yes, then I can talk to them and explain the process more. But it's a little bit of a dicey proposition because you're relying on nurses and doctors to convey, that it's not scary to talk to media. Sometimes people are really into it, but with kids, especially pediatric patients, a lot of times, we don't know what those nurses and doctors are saying in terms of, are you willing to talk to media? So we worry, about how they're presenting it. I always kind of say, just ask them if they'd be willing to talk to me, and then I can give them more information. But we really run into very few problems finding patients that way and then consenting them to do stories. The second thing would be protecting patients in public areas when video crew, for a broadcast news crew would come in, and we had a request a couple weeks ago on this caffeine and pregnancy story where the reporter said, I want to come in and interview an OBGYN about caffeine and pregnancy, and I want to do it in a clinic setting with a lot of pregnant women behind her. And I'm like, that is just not going to happen, unfortunately. I mean, there's no way to consent a room full of people, and even if we could, we wouldn't do that to our patients. That would be disruptive. So unfortunately that didn't happen, but those for her. But we've kind of found some ways around it to try to help people because we still want to be helpful. We have a beta tape that has all of our exteriors and signage. So if you need exteriors of Duke Health System, you can get those pictures without having to stand in front of the hospital and get the patient who's coming out of the cancer clinic who no one knew he had cancer, and now it's on the evening news. Because a lot of it's to protect not only the patient, but to protect the institution. I mean, our big fear is that we're going to get, we've got drawers and drawers of HIPAA forms, and we're just waiting for the day that someone calls, and we've got to make sure that we had a HIPAA form on that patient who's now complaining. The third thing would be our pager, which I'm sure is the same at UNC, but those are the kind of calls you get, from the breaking news. We've got this page, we want to know what condition so-and-so's in. I end up calling back and say we don't have someone listed by that name. Well, they probably know the patient's at Duke. So then, sometimes reporters will get creative and they'll say, so you're saying he was discharged? Things like that, and they're trying to trap you. And it's actually, HIPAA can be kind of helppful because you just can basically say, this is all I can give you. I can give you the condition. I had someone actually die at Duke, and the reporter knew that patient had died at Duke, and we could say he died at Duke, but we couldn't say the time or date, and they wanted to know the time or day. So what time was it? He kept asking me. It was actually humorous after a while, and he was just trying to trap me into giving that information. So, all I could tell him was, all I can tell you is, he's deceased. So those are sort of the three big areas where it comes into play for us.
Well, thank you. And our final panel member is Amber Rupinta, who's health reporter for WTVD in Durham, and I'm hoping, and I'm sure you're going to talk about the special difficulties faced by broadcast reporters with all your equipment, and it's not so easy to just come into Duke Medical Center or UNC Health Systems with the equipment and a camera person. So what are your special concerns as a TV health reporter?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges in broadcast journalism is that you have to have that camera to get your story, where I think in print they can get quotes over the phone and they don't have to get face-to-face with people. So that's the biggest challenge. And I think in my position, because I do a couple of different jobs, I do health and fitness 3 days a week, but I also cover general assignment stories on weekends, and on the weekends it's a very skeleton crew, so we all kind of do everything, making calls and trying to get conditions of people. And I also see when you have all the PIOs on staff at a healthcare facility during the week compared to nobody around on the weekend. So it's interesting for me from what I can see, and it's also been interesting picking up the health and fitness beat to see the difference in the accommodations, because I think the biggest challenge is in a breaking news or general assignment setting when news happens that you're trying to get information, especially in cases where maybe a public official is involved, if a police officer wrecks, and you're trying to, I mean, that is the story, is the condition of the police officer. And if they aren't in a position to be releasing that information yet, I think what it has done is it has made it easier for a PIO's job in a breaking news general assignment situation just to say to you, we can't release that information. I think it's made it more challenging, created more of a roadblock for a journalist to have to become more creative, to dig deeper, to question more people on a scene, and hopefully get accurate information, but I think at times it can affect the accuracy of a story. I think that it also, especially on weekends, it's hard for us to get a lot of information on car accidents and things because you need names. So you might hear on the weekends much more vague descriptions of the condition of the two patients were taken to the hospital and their condition is unknown. That really means that there was no one able to give us the names. The police haven't released the names yet, and we couldn't get it from. So I think in that way, it's certainly made a challenge for reporters. I was talking to another reporter today about Hipaa because we were just kind of discussing this panel, and what he brought up an interesting point was he thinks that it kind of guides our coverage, especially in a case where we were talking about in the fair, where a lot of children picked up E. coli from the fair. And as a broadcast journalist, you want to tell a personal story. You want to get to those patients, and we had absolutely no way of getting to those people. The state wasn't releasing information. Even if we knew where they were treated, there was no way. There's juveniles involved. It's just not going to happen. So rather than being able to get somebody to tell the story, you're focusing more just on the facts and what E. coli is, and maybe talking to an expert to tell you. So it guides the coverage that you're allowed to give out to the public. So it can steer how you cover a story. But again, in a breaking news situation too, I think it also can affect the aggressiveness of a reporter. We had a case where we were dealing with Duke Lacrosse, where they were saying the alleged victim, there was rumors that she was pregnant. And our managers would actually sit around discussing, well, how do we report this? How do we report this? Obviously, we can't get this confirmed. And then you would have a reporter go on television saying, my sources tell me. So I think in that way, you also have to question who your sources are, and it goes in a case-by-case basis of each outlet, and managers play a huge role in that. They're, in a sense, have to become our gatekeepers, where these folks are the gatekeepers on a day-to-day basis. So from different standpoints, when I'm covering health and fitness, it's great. They pitch stories. If I have a story, I'll call them. They help set up patients. And we understand you stay with them at the hospital from the moment you walk in the door to the moment you walk out. They're with you. And it's just a little bit more of a cowboy atmosphere when you're on as a news story is happening and it's breaking news and you're trying to page them or make calls, and they're just getting the information too. So that gets filtered, I think, to the public. And I think as a journalist, it needs to be sourced as where you're getting your information. If it's coming from an eyewitness on the scene, I think it needs to be sourced as such, because obviously it's a little more accurate when you know you're getting it from a hospital setting. I think it also affects our follow-up to stories, because we're on such a 24-hour news cycle in what we do, that if it's a car accident and you don't know the extent of the injuries, then we're not going to be as inclined to follow up on a story. And again, that's just affecting follow-up. But I think it also forces the media to build and maintain relationships with public information officers. And when the Hipaa regulations first started coming out, we've seen a learning curve from our perspective, because everybody used to just say, I can't get the story, they're claiming Hipaa. And one reporter came to me and said, oh, you're doing a Hipaa workshop? Well, tell all the PIOs to stop saying Hipaa, Hipaa, Hipaa as an excuse, But that was his experience, and I don't think that the majority of journalists get that. I think we get that they have a job to do, and when they help us, they can, and when they can't, they tell us the truth. We can't release that information. So I think media outlets may need refresher courses. I think that would help us to kind of know where we stand with HIPAA and how to approach things a little bit easier, because like you were saying, going through a doctor, if I've ever called a doctor, they always say you have to go through the news office. Or they'll say, I'll do it, but make sure you call the news office and talk to so-and-so and let them know that I told you to talk to them, because they realize where they stand. I think as a journalist, it's a little bit more gray, and our job is to dig and uncover information, and we get resourceful in doing so, but sometimes you have to be more inclined to cite your sources, and I think you have to make sure that you're getting the story right. And if you're getting it from a source that's not an official source, I think you need to say it. So the bottom line, I think it does protect patients, but it creates more roadblocks and barriers for journalists, and it allows us, or forces us, to be more resourceful and to do a little bit more legwork to try to uncover something. And that's more in a breaking news day of story rather than a scheduled shoot for health and fitness or...
Yeah, well, thank you, Amber. I think the issue of working with PIOs is a gray area. I think most reporters are disinclined to be led by the hand to the story by anybody in a PR or PIO capacity. That removes a lot of the initiative and the enterprise on the reporter. On the other hand, I don't think any broadcast journalist would be stupid enough to go into a medical center or hospital without notifying the public information officer, because you won't get very far. So I think it is an interplay. And researchers, I think, are a different area as well. For example, yesterday we interviewed a Duke, students of mine interviewed a Duke researcher, and he's a geneticist working with sensory attraction among people through smell. And my student contacted him directly because I didn't really think there was a need to go through Duke News Service in order to make an initial contact with him to find out even if there was a story there. And then once the story is established, then I think, once we wanted access, then we contacted Duke. Let me open it up for questions. Yes, please.
And with apologies, because I was on the last panel, to Amber and Jean. In covering a story, if you have happened to get information, perhaps from an employee at a healthcare provider, and you know that that employee just violated HIPAA, first off, do you cover the story, or do you use that information in your story? And secondly, when I call you up and ask if it's one of our employees who gave you that information, would you give it to us?
Let me just repeat. So the question is...
Asking us to reveal our sources?
That was my question.
I'm sorry, I can't answer the question from HIPAA. That's a pretty specific scenario. I guess a lot of times, I always try when I am, none of the folks in official capacity are going to violate HIPAA. I've not had that happen where somebody, they tend to know their jobs, what they can and can't say, pretty well. If I'm working with someone who clearly is not practiced at working with the media, and they say something or do something that I know is in violation of the law, most of the time it's kind of marginal. Like, I was at a practice the other day, and they did, in the old days we used to, like I said, we used to just go to the doctor's office and say, hey, Mrs. Jones, will you talk to me? And I sort of had a version of that. I kind of averted my eyes while they, approached the patient and sort of discreetly asked them. But I saw who they went up to. It wasn't, technically I think if in a strict reading of the law, you could say that was a violation of HIPAA. But, they were being discreet. They were trying, not to make a big fuss of it. They weren't, introducing me to the patient until that patient said yes. So, I basically just looked the other way and said, okay. When the patient said yes, then I, introduced myself and we sat down and we talked and everything. So I've never had somebody sort of flagrantly violate HIPAA and give me information. I think it would be difficult. I mean, I don't think that if somebody, I mean, we'd have to come up with a more specific scenario, but I think it would be difficult if someone at Duke, for example, gave me information about a patient and told me, yes, we have the bus, crash victim, and oh, it's a really good story. It's this woman, and she has 3 kids, and she's hanging on to life. I mean, I don't see that happening. But if that happened, well, obviously we would want to try to tell that story. But I think it would be really, really hard because, I wouldn't. I'm not supposed to have that information, and I don't think that there's any way to officially, to get that information unless somebody in the family. I mean, I guess, if we were completely off the charts, you could say, since you've told me this, and you obviously have talked to the family enough to get that, can you ask, I would ask them to tell the family the media is interested, will you contact the media? Because if the family comes to you, all bets are off. I mean, a patient can't violate their own privacy. So if that happened, I guess that's what I would do. I would redirect and I would say, well, you've just told me something. I'd really like to do that story, but it has to come to me from the patient. So that's what I would do.
I have a related question. Amber, if you're in a doctor's office and you never know what your videographer is shooting, right? Exactly. You're not looking through the lens. Videographer happens to shoot some B-roll and catches the name of a patient prominently displayed on a chart. What's the obligation of the reporter once you get back and you see that B-roll?
Well, actually, we had an instance where this happened recently with a story that I did. We did a story at one of the hospitals about switching over to electronic medical records. And the photographer knew as he was shooting it, he was well informed, and they had their IT person there, and she kept trying to pull up every fake screen that she could for training purposes, but there was a couple, and one of them, it got on air. And I don't think any person in the general public would have looked at that and said, there's someone's name in the corner. I mean, you would have never been able to pick it out, but obviously because the Hipaa regulations are so strict, and they emailed and called immediately because they looked at it on the website, and we had to pull it. It aired, but we had to pull it off of our website. The photographer had to go back and change that frame before it could be put back into the public domain. But there was such a panic on the hospital side of it, because I think ultimately as a reporter in those situations, it should be, I think, a team effort to edit a piece like that. A lot of times the reality is that we are under deadline and you just don't have the time, or we work opposite shifts and I hand a script off and they edit it and I see it on the air too. So in a perfect world, you would both sit down and go over it with a fine-tooth comb before it hits air, but in a realistic world, that's just not how it happens. So I think that the responsibility should fall on both parties involved, because a photographer is a photojournalist as well, and they still have to adhere to the standards of broadcast journalists.
So
because they are.
there's mutual trust involved, and I want to ask Dr. Callaway, how far does your trust extend with reporters? And I guess it's probably a bigger issue for broadcast reporters because you don't know exactly what they're capturing and what they're not. So talk about level of trust between providers and reporters and the patient's right to privacy.
Well, first I would mention that all the Hipaa regulations now, you go through the health information officer and so forth, you tend to get more canned stories, I think, than you probably did get in the past. And we're skeptical of media reports because they always seem to be coming out of the PR department of one place or another. And I would encourage you to look beyond, sort of the obvious story and figure out if it's news or not. But I personally haven't been burned too badly by it. We hear horror stories about how somebody is misquoted or something's taken away out of context. I think physicians are skeptical of it because they're not comfortable talking in layman's terms. They're afraid of revealing something that's private. They're not used to working under deadlines. We work with patients all the time, sort of in a rapid fire fashion, but then you have to sort of take a moment out and immediately change subject. So I think physicians are a little bit scared and skeptical and afraid that something will get misconstrued or a patient will get angry about it. So there is a certain amount of concern, and I think probably it would help to have the same reporter deal with you from time to time so that you can have a relationship as opposed to a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
Thank you. Yes?
If I could speak to that too, long before HIPAA, newsrooms had policies regarding private and personal information. I work for WRL-TV, I'm a manager in the newsroom. We don't show socials, we don't show patient records, we don't show names. We take great steps and great pains to guard against any type of personal information being released. In the day and age of TiVo and DVR, multiple platforms online, we take great pains if something were to slip through to erase that from all platforms, because that's just the right thing to do. Public record, that's a completely different story, but HIPAA plays in, but I think it's each individual media outlet that also has their own policy in place.
So you're saying journalistic ethics also may take precedence over HIPAA for journalists, because journalists aren't bound by HIPAA, but they are bound by their own ethics.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I think it's interesting too, when you get into medical records and issues of privacy in that case, I'm not sure if it was that somebody said, if you're walking through a hospital with your camera and, you happen to see somebody know and wave, and, well, that has nothing to do with us being a part of the media. I could be up going to visit my grandmother and see somebody I know, and that's not a violation of that person's privacy because I just happen to be walking down the hallway and I'm a member of the media. Or like what you were saying about, you have video of exteriors of Duke Hospital where nobody's walking around. Well, if we're on a public sidewalk and shooting exteriors of Duke Hospital, those people are in the public domain. The right to privacy changes at that point, and we can shoot whatever video we want at that point because, they're viewable from a public position. So I think that there's some conflict between what's covered under HIPAA and what's covered under regular privacy laws. And we come across this too, in not just in the medical community, but in the crime community as well. When you're standing at a crime scene and you see something on the other side of the tape, and then a police officer comes up to you and says, "Oh no, you have to go 3 blocks away." It's like, well, this person's standing right here, this public citizen standing right here. You have to remember that although we're members of the media, we're also public citizens, and you can't restrict us from doing things just because if you're not going to restrict the general public from doing it.
Well, I just wanted to say, I don't think that, at least from what I was saying, I don't think I was suggesting that if cameras, if cameras are in, the hospital and you see someone, you're just going to start shooting and, that kind of thing. But I think one of the things that we, from an institution perspective, have to be very sensitive of is when photographers or reporters are walking through the halls, there are other eyes that are seeing you, and they get a little anxious. And then we hear, about that angst, and so we have to also think about them and make sure that, they're there to be cared for and that that's not interrupted. And so, so.
And we want to be sensitive to that.
Yeah.
Yes. And I'm going to try to repeat, I'm supposed to repeat the question so posterity can hear your question.
I just want to follow up on that, thinking a little bit more from, say, a patient's perspective. If, hypothetically, if I'm the patient who happens to have their name up there on the TV screen accidentally, would I have grounds to sue for a violation of my privacy? And so, am I suing the hospital? Is it the PIO who's sort of held liable in that situation, or?
Let me throw that question to the lawyers who are here. So the question is, if your name is on a monitor or a chart or somehow visible within a hospital or a clinic, and it ends up in a photograph or on video, does the patient have grounds to sue either the provider or the hospital? And are you including suing the media as well, or just the hospital or the provider?
I'm a psychologist, and so I deal with a lot of patients. And it seems, even if it's accidental, it seems almost inevitable that these things will occur. And I was very much interested in what Amy had said earlier about how there's now some sort of state, soon to be a precedent, or there's a case on appeal where abiding by HIPAA is going to be considered basic standard of care. And if there's even an accidental disregard of HIPAA or a mistake,
A negligence.
who's going to win?
Negligence
ultimately?
is the standard we were talking about in that case. And the concept of negligence is the exercise of reasonable care. And if in the medical record example you were talking about, the provider was the one that gave you those screenshots, and they were negligent in giving you a screenshot of actual patient, Amy, then the patient would probably have a cause of action against the provider. If the press didn't have any reason to know that that was a real patient, then I don't know where the lawsuit would come out against the press in that situation, but I could certainly see a claim against the provider if there was negligence in that kind of situation.
And what if it was a photograph or video of a patient, of a monitor, like in the emergency department, where the patient's names are listed, and a videographer took a picture of that? Does any responsibility legally lie with the photojournalist?
I don't know. I'm not going to answer that question.
Any other lawyers who want to venture an opinion?
I don't think there would be any liability. I think that the irony of the question, and I think it's a good question, is if you were to sue for an invasion of privacy, you're likely also going to sue for a negligent or tortious interference or emotional distress or something like that. If you want your life splayed out for everyone to encounter, the first thing you do is file a negligent infliction of emotional distress claim. You will not have a stone uncovered in your life. And so for this blip of a screenshot of somebody's name, which you can't read necessarily what they've got, or what condition they had or whatever else, now you're splaying over, well, when I was 4, I skinned my knee and my mom took me to the emergency room, and all of that sort of stuff. People have come to me with invasion of privacy cases. Now, we do a lot defending the media on privacy actions, but of course, if you know one side of the law, you probably ought to do both. And that's one of the first things I say. Are you really sure you want to go down this path if you're so concerned about your privacy? Because once we put it into the court, I have almost no control. And I'm not going to advocate that you're somehow more special than the other 20,000 people who filed a lawsuit in Wake County last year, that you should be able to proceed anonymously and all of that sort of thing. So you may not have the private right of action under HIPAA, and so you don't have that instantaneous $50,000 in damages, which I think the plaintiff's lawyers logically said, well, here's our way to go about it. In an invasion of privacy case, you would have to prove up your damages, and I think that'd be very hard to do. And so you may have a technical right of action, and you may have a theoretical claim for damages, but the downside of it is pretty darn high.
Thank you. That was a nice little Pachelbel canon interview. We have time for one or two more questions. Any more questions for any of our panel members? I have one more question for the PIOs, and that is, what irritates you most about reporters when it comes to their dealings with you in the hospital context?
No names, please.
Do you really want to know?
Yes.
Yeah, I want to know. No names.
I think one of the things that frustrate me is kind of the scenario that you gave when reporters go directly to physicians and try to, or maybe they don't try to, but bypass the public affairs and marketing office. I mean, because we really can be useful. We can cut down on some of maybe the legwork that you're doing, and we can probably gain access to that researcher or that clinician a bit quicker than what you can. And so if you just give us an opportunity, sometimes I think we could help and work together and be able to do all these different things. But it's a bit discouraging sometimes when I get calls from clinicians or researchers that say, yeah, this reporter's coming at 2:30 and it's 1 o'clock, and they've set this up weeks ago, or something like that. And that just it makes at least from my perspective, it makes my job a little bit harder, because there are reporters who do call in advance, who do work with us to set up stories and patients, and so then I have to shift kind of what I'm doing for that day to also accommodate someone who just kind of decided on their own that I'm just going to do this. So.
Does any reporter want to respond to that? Or are you?
Well,
And, you know, we try to do the best that we can with that. But I think sometimes the confusion comes up because, like, for example, the University of North Carolina has an experts guide,
Yep.
right? So they encourage us to call those experts, and Duke does as well, to call those experts directly. Like,
Well,
here's our guide, we've already talked to them, they're ready to deal with the media, if you know, if they're available, here's their phone number, give them a call. So then we call and set them up. So I think sometimes there's a little bit.
We've actually redone and done that for that. We had that a few years ago, and
Yeah.
we've had sort of some reorganization. We would rather you come through us, so we don't provide. We're going to
So,
not
you know,
provide their
sometimes
numbers
and
anymore.
sometimes it's the people, you know,
Yeah, and in our experts guide, we have the PIOs in our guide, and, you know, we say Stephanie Creighton can help, you know, set up interviews with Dr. So-and-so, and here's her number and her email, so yeah.
But I think sometimes it's the perception. I mean, probably but most people are very easy to work with, but there have been people who have come up and, you know, it's the perception of sort of all access. And if you can't have all access, it's because I'm trying to put rein you in, and that's not it. It's just that you can't go in to pick you in February because there's contagious diseases, you know, things like that. And there is sort of sometimes that attitude of like, well, why can't I stay here all day and follow this patient around, and I want to go in here and out, you know, and that kind of thing. And that can be frustrating because, again, I'm not trying to say, you know, you can't go, you know, trying to control things. It's just more of, you know, protecting the patients.
Stephanie, I do draw a distinction, though, between a telephone call that's a pre-interview in scoping out a story where I don't really feel that I need to go through the PR or PIO mechanism and actually coming in and doing an interview on camera, in which case I would always contact you.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't think it's, I mean, I would think most reporters, but I don't want to speak for the reporters, would blanch at the thought that all contact with sources must go through PIOs first. I mean, somehow that grates me the wrong way as a journalist.
No. Go ahead. I was just going to say, I think what I'm suggesting, though, is that we can be of help to reporters if you give us the opportunity, and sometimes we're not given that opportunity.
Can I
Is
chime
that-
in?
Well, I agree. Jean?
Yeah, I think it kind of depends. I mean, a lot of times, I mean, I think that the faculty, especially at UNC and Duke, they are well trained to say you need to go through media relations. But if you have an existing relationship with that faculty member, if you've done a story on someone, you develop a rapport, a lot of times the doctors will say, hey, this has been great working with you. Feel free to email me or call me. I always keep those relationships, and that's how you develop those good ties, and you develop the ability to call someone and say, I want to do a story about this, but I'm not really sure if it's legitimate. What do you think? And that's how you develop those contacts to vet stories. And I don't think that you're trying to get in the way of that. I mean, I think Lauren said she's not. So there's that. But I will say, I mean, I think a couple of people have made comments that, you know, that it's HIPAA and just sort of, it has sort of herded the media through the PIO function. And I think that that's true, but I do think that they help more than they hinder, you know, and that even when you're getting a lot of story pitches, it doesn't mean you have to say yes. I mean, I probably say no 20 times for every time I say yes. And even when people call with a story pitch that you don't do, if they've got a patient, you know, I've been pitched lots of stories where I wasn't really interested in the story, but I'll take that patient and keep them. And then the next time I need a woman with heart disease, then I've got one. And, you know, so there are ways, even if you don't say yes to the story, that their offices can be of use to you. And I think that those, in the end, are probably more valuable relationships to cultivate than not.
I agree. I don't disagree with that at all.
Well, I was just going to say, can I just
yes.
say one thing? I kind of think of it more as like we can serve as sort of the admin person. Sometimes if you go to a doctor and they're not going to pick up their phone, but their secretary might say, oh, he can talk to you next Thursday. And we sort of understand the press a little bit more and know that you probably need to talk to that person a little bit sooner than next Thursday, and I can probably get to him maybe quicker than they can. So that's sort of, I wouldn't try to restrict you from talking to that person. I just want to be helpful.
Yeah. Thank you. Last question, then we'll have lunch. Well, actually, we'll have a word from Charlie. Professor Tuggle, yes.
I understand in many cases it's true. You can be extremely helpful. But in, say, an investigatory circumstances where something might be detrimental to the hospital, you are charged with putting that organization in a good light. If so, I could see a time when it might be the reporter's benefit to try to go around you rather than getting steered to someone who's going to cast some spin.
Oh, yeah, it happens, it's going to continue to happen. I think the question that was asked, what are some things that kind of, get under my skin? And that would be it. I mean, again, I've been a reporter, so I understand. I know the game. So I know kind of how it's played, and I know what needs to be done. And so I'm going to try to do what I can. But then, yeah, you're right. I work for the institution, so I'm also, accountable to them.